Less than 2 weeks into the US-Israel-Iran war, the repercussions are already reverberating around the globe. For its part, China has called for peace, but avoided direct criticism of President Trump. Beijing gets nearly half of its oil imports from the Middle East and has a strategic partnership with Iran. At the same time, with the United States bogged down in another Middle East war, it has less attention and resources devoted to the Indo-Pacific. I'm Adam Gallagher, a contributing fellow at Defense Priorities, and today I'll be speaking with Lyle Goldstein. He directs the Asia program at Defense Priorities, and him and I are going to unpack what's at stake for China in this war. Here are 3 things you need to know.
Hey, Lyle. Thanks for joining me today to discuss what's at stake for China in this war with Iran. I was wondering if you could start us off by just walking through a little bit how China has responded to the war now that we're about 2 weeks in, and if anything about that response has surprised you as a dedicated China watcher.
Mhm. Well, thanks for doing this very much. Glad to share some thoughts with you. It's a very sort of troubling time in the world. I think China's response in general has been pretty low key. They have, I think they've condemned the attacks. Suggested that they're really destabilizing. They've made some kind of symbolic gestures to show support, but it's worth emphasizing from the beginning that they don't have any kind of alliance with Iran, and as we'll discuss, their ties are fairly at a fairly low level, particularly in the military strategic area. So, I think around the edges, China has been making some moves. I think cutting the amount of I think diesel that they export. So taking some prudent measures to make sure that China does not face shortages. I don't think that's a risk certainly in the short and probably the medium term. But that's as is sort of customary for Chinese diplomacy, they've offered to send diplomats to mediate, and they've strongly urged both sides to rein in the violence. I think one of the keys here that I'm watching closely, of course, as all China experts are, is that the summit is still on, and that does surprise me a little bit.
Trump, you mean?
Yes, exactly. So at the end of the month, both the Chinese and American presidents will meet. And that, of course, is it's a historic moment. It's very important for both countries and for the world. I believe that summit was in jeopardy, but the Chinese have sent some signals that they want to do it. It still could go off the rails, but
Right.
I'm pleased that is going forward, and it shows that China, values a working relationship with the U.S. over some kind of, building this into some kind of global confrontation.
Right. So you hear a lot on both sides about kind of what's at stake here for China. Is this a good thing for China or a bad thing for China? It gets half of its oil from the Middle East. It does have this sort of strategic partnership with Iran. On the other hand, it's, happy to see the United States bogged down in another Middle East war. Can you unpack for us what's really at stake here? What interests does China have at stake in this Iran war?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's true that China does get some energy from Iran, although I think it's lower than most people realize. It's really quite a small percentage of China's total energy mix, and I want to emphasize and some great work recently by Rosemary Kalanick, my colleague at Defense Priorities. She had a wonderful piece in the New York Times where she laid out that, in a way, China is less vulnerable, in fact, than the United States, because China, within its own energy mix, it's been quite markedly reducing the level of oil. In fact, I think between 2023 and 2024, it actually reduced its total oil consumption, which is pretty remarkable. And let's also recall that China gets a lot more oil from Russia than it does from Iran, and that I believe that the Russians for a while have been wanting actually to build another oil pipeline into China, so that will likely go forward along with some other projects. So inadvertently, this war is serving as a yet another impetus for China-Russia economic and strategic coordination. I mean, at a larger level, I also think it's good to keep in mind, I believe former Secretary of State Pompeo made a statement where he said, this is we've struck a blow against China, more or less, was his argument. I don't think that's true at all. Actually, people don't realize, but China has, sure, they have a partnership with Iran, but they also have a partnership with countries throughout the whole Gulf area, the very close ties with UAE, particularly with Oman, a key state.
And with the Saudis, right?
And with the Saudis, yeah. Right. So really, China has never had in mind the idea of kind of jumping on one side of the various regional rivalries. They're playing both sides, if you will, in a balanced way. I think that's a sort of mature approach to regional diplomacy and development. And let's give them a little credit, even for at one point they were instrumental in bringing the Saudis and the Iranians back together. That happened in 2023, and I remember a lot of people were admiring China's diplomatic efforts in the Middle East at that point, and hoping that they might do more.
Right. So, why hasn't China been more involved yet? And do you expect it to be, whether that's on a security or diplomatic front? And then I think I'd like to hear you zoom out a little bit and talk about more broadly what this kind of means on the heels of the kidnapping of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro for China's, so-called alliances or strategic partnerships around the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think China, frankly, watching our mistakes over the last several decades has taught them lessons I think they already knew, that there are a lot of perils of trying to get really involved in other regions, maybe especially the Middle East, and in fact among Chinese international relations scholars, they're fond of saying the Middle East is a graveyard of superpowers, and they're well acquainted with how the Afghanistan intervention tripped up the Soviet Union so badly, and maybe even played a role in its collapse. And they have studied our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan thoroughly as well. So, so they're well aware of that they come at this without, any kind of major ambitions to get very involved, let alone to kind of orchestrate, security and economic arrangements in the region. What they are interested in is development, but also put more crudely, in making lots of money, and they indeed have a very large piece of these markets across the board in the Middle East. So that's really, I think they're looking to promote that more stable approach. Now, you mentioned the Maduro, our action against Venezuela, and there, I do think there is. I don't think it's high probability. I would call it low probability, but there is a kind of small possibility that even in Beijing, that they are kind of realizing that they have to make sure that you said before that maybe some in China are happy that the U.S. is bogged down in another Middle Eastern war that will sap its strength, including in the Indo-Pacific, by the way. I'll grant that, but I'm concerned that China could come to the conclusion that they have to act more robustly against U.S. efforts across the globe. I don't think they're there really anywhere near that decision yet, but they could make life harder for us around the world. They seemingly have chosen not to go that route at this point. For example, there are a lot of people who don't like us, both in the Middle East and in Latin America, and China has not really made any major effort to support those groups, sending weapons and so forth in support. But I am concerned that if the pattern of kind of zero-sum interaction continues, if we don't stabilize our relations with China generally, that that China may also kind of embrace a more zero sum, if you will, a new Cold War. We have to do everything we can to avoid that. We don't want China to come to that conclusion. I mean, there are, I'll just put it on the table, there are a few disturbing things we're seeing. I mean, for example, Chinese companies, I think, have published satellite photos of, various U.S. deployments to the Middle East. And there is some evidence that there were negotiations about anti-ship missiles going from China to Iran. That didn't happen, but these are the kind of futures we may be looking at if we go toward this new Cold War. So we should, I'm hopeful for the summit between Trump and Xi. I don't have very high expectations, but if we can stabilize the bilateral relationship overall, hopefully we can avoid this high intensity militarized rivalry, which I think will hurt both countries and the whole world.
Well, thanks, Lyle. I think that's a good place to end during a dark time amid this war. Maybe a place for some cautious optimism.
Thanks a lot, Adam.
Yep. For more on the Iran war, visit defensepriorities.org and check out all the analysis and content that we're producing there.